follows an extract from my book Letters from the Broom Cupboard, available from Amazon. Dear reader, there is always some form of associated paraphernalia that comes with any sort of interest group. Rubber wristbands go a long way towards helping us broadcast our affinity with particular partialities, rather like a personal bumper sticker. Even so, we always manage to find bizarre ways of spending our money to publicise our partisanship. Some of the accoutrements carried around by musicians are necessary, such as cork grease or instrument cleaners, but it's amazing how we find ways to justify gathering all sorts of bits and bobs for imagined coolness factor more than purposes of base utility. As a young teenager, I felt quite the rebel when purchasing cigarette papers, ostensibly to dry off the flute keypads after long periods of playing. This was in fact doubly cool because it implied that I was a dedicated musician who practised for long hours and so needed to dry off the keypads at intervals during playing. It also left hanging the possibility that I might use the papers for their original purpose and actually smoke them. Out of my peers, I can't think of a single individual who would have really dared to smoke, but ownership of these packets of papers left the whole question open. You would never really know. Of course, the dichotomy of being a serious wind player and the detrimental effects that smoking has on a player's lung capacity never entered our precious skulls. The potentially more dangerous accessory popular among wind players is the miniature screwdriver. I'm not directly referring to the item as being dangerous to our actual person or our contemporaries, though with sufficient provocation, who knows. During my school orchestra days, the concept in carrying this hazardous device inside your instrument case was to create a public display of your adeptness at performing minor alterations and repairs to your instrument on the hoof. I suspect that this was almost entirely vain pretence. If there were as many fumbling attempts at DIY repairs as there were screwdrivers in cases, the repercussions would have been evident in the resultant trips to our friendly local instrument repair workshop. He would be driving a much flashier car by now if even half of the supposed repairs were ventured. I know that I never dared to wield the thing despite having 2 or 3 rattling around next to my flute. A perfect example of how a little learning is a dangerous thing is exquisitely demonstrated in the personage of Bert. Bert was in his late 70s and came to me for both flute and piano lessons. Many people attend lessons in their later years and I'm glad that they do. Sadly, Bert was not a healthy specimen and playing an instrument took its toll on the dear chap. He'd assemble his flute, and as he began to play some warm-up exercises, he'd begin to puff and perspire away. At intervals he'd stop and have a sit down, explaining that he had a heart condition and needed to take things easy. It was during these frequent breaks that the real trouble would start. Out would come the miniature screwdriver set, and before long I'd be crawling around on my hands and knees, scouring the carpet for the tiniest of screws that had sprung off in the most unpredictable directions. This occurred with alarming regularity. Despite my gentle pleas for him to leave well alone, his enthusiasm for constant tweaking was unabated, and when I suggested that, if there was a genuine problem, he'd perhaps be better taking his flute along to a specialist, though there was no perhaps about it. Bert was visibly offended and I didn't like to pursue the topic further. He just couldn't help himself. I think that many years ago, in a previous life, Bert had been an engineer of sorts. Now his health was poor, his nerves were shot, and his hands shook like leaves on a tree in a gale. But he didn't let that stop him. I had to admire his tenacity, even if it was sadly misplaced. His ultimate solution to the scattering of screws was to solder everything into place. Now, I realise that I'm no expert, but I'm far from convinced that this was a good idea, and I've a vague inkling that a minuscule amount of manoeuvrability is necessary to the smooth action of the keys. The level of wear on the pads must surely dictate the occasional loosening or tightening of screws, performed by a knowledgeable expert. If this weren't the case, surely all of these fixtures and fittings would be properly secured in the first place. Even if I am mistaken in this assumption, I feel quite certain that great blobs of common garden flux shouldn't be utilised. I'm a great believer in the make do and mend ethos, but even I accept that there are limits. At least Bert's piano lessons were a more sedentary form of music making. He was sitting down at least. Of course, it was necessary for him to use my instrument, pianos not being particularly portable. I had a grand piano at the time and, on no grounds whatsoever, would I lift the lid up during this lesson time. In lessons with other students, I'd sometimes find it helpful to lift the piano lid to show the working mechanisms of the piano and so that the student could see the dampener board and the sustain pedal in action. Bert would have to use his imagination. In an early lesson, he once told me that he tuned his own piano and he had adjusted the pedal action to make it easier to use. I needed no further warning but kept the lid firmly shut from then on. The unfortunate trade-off of a more relaxed lesson at the piano was that the entire lesson would have to be spent playing. Those intervals of rest that Bert needed during a flute lesson provided some welcome respite, and even scouring the carpet for wayward screws helped to while away the minutes. Nevertheless, a seemingly never-ending half hour at the piano was a small price to pay for the assurance that my own instrument would still be intact at the end of the lesson. Gratefully yours. For the full collection of letters from the Broom Cupboard, available from Amazon in paperback or as an ebook, follow the links in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.